We're skipping forward quite a lot in the book to the next selection, which is on page 45. So if you can find the bit, it should be the next bit in your pages. Page 45. And this comes in the wake of a section in the book where he speaks about paradoxical unity, that the unity of God is not something simple and easily understood, but something paradoxical and deep and mysterious in itself. Just following up a little bit on what on one of the themes we were talking about before, where he speaks about the idea in the introduction that the unity of God is primary and the Trinity flows from the unity. It takes me back to when I was at university and doing a lot of study within the context of history and late antiquity. I did a lot of study, because I was interested in it, of early church controversies and councils and heresies and all of that sort of thing, which fascinated me. And in the course of that, I was looking a lot at the Arian controversy, St. Athanasius, and also the Nicene Fathers, St. Gregory and the two Basils, two Gregories rather, and St. Basil, and I was using Harnack a lot. I don't know if anybody knows Harnack. So I know Harnack's quite a controversial figure, especially his views about Judaism, which were not great. But he has very interesting insights into the difference, as he sees it, between St. Athanasius in the early 4th century and the Nicene Fathers, Gregory of Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Basil, who later on, in the late 4th, early 5th century, I think, around then. And he says, and I can't go into detail on this because I can't remember the detailed arguments, but he argues that for St. Athanasius, indeed, as Pierre Lenhardt says, it was the unity of God that was the most primary, fundamental given of Christianity. And any concept of Trinity had to sort of flow from the unity of God, but the unity always remained primary. Whereas, Harnack argues, I'm not qualified to judge whether he's right, that for the Nicene Fathers, it was kind of the other way round. They start off, and this is well after the Council of Nicaea, way up into the sort of the later 4th century, they start off with the fundamental dogma of the Trinity. And then they have to work their way back philosophically to the unity that underlies the Trinity, but their starting point is Trinity. It's a very interesting distinction that Harnack makes. And it interested me very much that in this book, Pierre Lenhardt, towards the end, quotes in full what's known as the Athanasian Creed. Of course, it's not by St. Athanasius, it's much later, but it's sort of expressing a Trinitarian faith in that Athanasian vein. And he clearly, is in that Athanasian tradition where unity is what is primary and the Trinity flows from and has to be, as it were, argued from the unity, not the other way around. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but it was a resonance that jumped out at me because of my background there. So let's have a little read of this, and this is where we'll encounter quite a lengthy Jewish liturgical text that he quotes, and let's keep in mind the listening and see where he's going with his argument here. For me, it was around this point, I have to say, that I really got into what he was saying. Up to then it was all a bit introductory and I wasn't quite clear where he was going with it. And it's in this section, in the next few pages, that he really starts to make what I think are really interesting and distinctive arguments. But we'll start off with the Second Vatican Council. And are you happy to carry on reading around the room? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start from a different starting point this time. The lady who came in, what's your name?
Oh, Jill.
Jill. Hi, Jill. Welcome. Would you like to start us off on page 45, where the heading is the one and only Old and New Covenant?
Just one paragraph.
Yes, that's right. And we'll go on to the next person.
Since the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church recalls and teaches that the Old Covenant was never revoked. For a long time, this was ignored and or forgotten by many Christians, among them important church fathers, exegetes and theologians. Still, in our day, certain exegetes who take a few verses in the letter to the Hebrews literally affirm that the new covenant takes the place of the covenant of Sinai.
It is true that the relationship of the new covenant to the old is paradoxical and difficult to explain. However, it is possible to say how the paradox must be assumed. For Israel's tradition, the new, which must be taught for the sake of the necessary of the Torah, is radically new because it was not known, not heard of before it was taught. This does not mean just any newness that is suggested irresponsibly and erroneously, but the new, which the disciple uncovers in the presence of his master, or at least with conviction that his master would teach it if he were still alive. This newness existed in reality already from time immemorial, from the origin of the Torah. In that sense, the new is not new, it is old. This is a paradox of revelation which must be assumed as such by every good scribe who draws from his treasure new and old. The liturgy for the Feast of Rosh Hashanah teaches that ever since Noah, God concluded the one and only covenant with humanity.
Thank you. Just to point out, on this really interesting statement, the newness existed in reality already from time immemorial, from the origin of the Torah. And there's a little tiny footnote there. Compare Jerusalem Talmud Peah 2:6, etc. Now, the reference there is to a famous statement in the Jerusalem Talmud, which says that any novel interpretation which a disciple speaks in front of his master was already revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. And that's the paradox that he's trying to grasp here. It's expressed in those stark terms in the Talmud. So this clever student thinks they've come up with a nice new interpretation, but somehow that was already there, right from Moses. Yeah? And the rabbis are well aware that that's not literally true, but at a deeper, as it were, paradoxical level, there's a truth there, that the Torah is capable of this endless renewal. He's making the argument, I think, that that Christianity was such a radical renewal, but already had its roots in what was there from of old. Yeah. Okay, shall we go on?
The blessing,
Zichronot,
is one of the three blessings in the additional prayer, Musaf, for the feast of Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year in the September time, and the Zichronot means remembrance, and it's one of the major sections of the service on the Jewish New Year, unique to that day.
The first of these blessings, the Malchiyot, royalties blessing, celebrates God as King of the universe. We shall study it at the end of the first part, text 49. The third blessing, the Shofar's blessing, celebrates God who instituted the blowing of the shofar, the main rite of Rosh well, the New Year, right? which signifies judgment and announces redemption. The additional prayer of Rosh Hashanah is the only one that includes 3 blessings at its center. Each of these 3 blessings implements the necklace of which we spoke in connection with text 18.
Okay.
The Zikronot blessing and the additional prayer on Rosh Hashanah. You remember the everlasting deed, and you recall all the former creatures. All hidden things are unveiled before you, as well as the multitude of mysteries since the beginning. This day was the beginning of your works. It is the remembrance of the first day, for it is a law, a prescription of the God of Jacob. For the remembrance of each deed presents itself before you, and you examine the deeds of each one.
Thus, in your love, you remembered Noah, as it is said in your Torah, and God remembered Noah.
And it is said in Exodus, God spoke there groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And it is said, Leviticus 26:42, and I shall remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham I shall remember, and I shall remember the land.
Thanks. Can I just suggest gently, don't bother reading the biblical references in brackets, because they're not there in the actual prayer, so they're just kind of, just let's get the flow of it. But wherever there's in italics here, that's a biblical quotation, yeah? Thank you.
And in your holy words it is written, saying, He established a remembrance, the Lord is clement and merciful. And it is said, He gives food to those who fear him. He always remembers his covenant. And it is said, and he remembered his covenant for rain. He let himself be swayed according to his great love. And by the hand of your servants, the prophets, it is written, saying, Go and cry this in the ears of Jerusalem. Thus the Lord has spoken. I remember for you the tenderness of your youth, the love of your betrothal, when you followed me in the desert in an uncultivated land. And it is said, and I shall remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth, and I shall fulfill for you an everlasting covenant. And it is said, Is Ephraim thus for me a beloved son, a child who is so cherished that every time I speak of him, I again want to remember him? Truly, my entrails are moved for him. I will have mercy on him. Word of the Lord.
Says the Lord,
Our God and God of our fathers, remember us with a good remembrance before you, and visit us with a visit of salvation and of mercy from the heights of the eternal heavens. And Lord our God, remember for us the covenant, the love and the oath that you swore to Abraham our father on Mount Moriah. May you be seen before you the binding by which Abraham our father bound Isaac his son on the altar. He held back his mercy in order to do your will with an undivided heart. You as well, may your mercy hold back your anger against us. Through your great goodness, may your anger turn from your people, from your city, and from your inheritance.
Lord our God, fulfill for us the promise that you made us in your Torah through Moses your servant, the promise that came from your glory, as it is said. And for them I shall remember the covenant of the firstborns, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, in the eyes of the people, in order to be their God, I, the Lord.
But you remember everything that is forgotten forever, and there is no forgetting before your glorious throne, and you will remember today the binding of Isaac in favour of his descendants. Blessed are you, Lord, who remembers the covenant.
This blessing celebrates.
But so one moment.
Sorry.
Thank you. I just, before we go on to his discussion, I just want to just add a little bit of commentary to that, just to explain what's happening there. So, as he says, the additional service, which is the main service really, for the New Year festival, which is part of our penitential season, has a unique structure of three major sections that you don't get any other time, as he said, on Malchuyot, God's sovereignty, Zichronot, remembrance, one we have here, and Shofarot, which is about redemption, the blowing of the shofar as a sign of redemption. And each one has what he calls here the charizah, the necklace approach of stringing verses together like pearls on a necklace. And the structure of it, so there's an introductory paragraph, and then it goes to the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the first section of the Bible, and has 3 quotations, 3 verses from the Torah. Then it goes to the writings, which is the 3rd section of the Jewish Bible, and has 3 verses, 3 quotations from the writings. And then it goes back to the prophets, the middle section of the Bible, and has 3 quotations from the prophets. Those wonderful verses there from Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And then there's a concluding liturgical passage that invokes the binding of Isaac, the concluding blessing, and then the shofar is blown. He doesn't mention that there, but after each of these major sections there is a blowing of the shofar with repeated blasts of different kinds, and this punctuates the service, these 3 great sections. So he's going to say what he's going to say, but I just wanted to explain the way that works out. And just to change things up a little bit, there's a musical setting of that section from the writings, the Jeremiah passage at the very top of page 47, which is, there's a musical setting by Lewandowski, great 19th century German Jewish liturgical composer, and I think it's the most beautiful musical setting of anything in the whole year. And I'll just give you a tiny bit of it. Goes, so this is, I remember for you the tenderness of your youth. That's where it starts. Zacharti lach chesed neoraich ahavat klolotaich lechtech acharai bamidbar beretz lo zeruah. And then skipping ahead a little bit to the is Ephraim thus for me a beloved son? It continues. There's other stuff in between. Aben yakirli Ephraim im yeled shashuim midei dabri bo zachor and so on and so forth. That's just a little snatch from it, and it doesn't give you the proper choral kind of, the soaring sopranos for those who have a mixed choir. And anyway, it's very, very beautiful, and that's one of the highlights, one of the central sections of the prayers on Rosh Hashanah. Of course, not all synagogues do that particular setting, but it's very, very beautiful. So, okay, after that little musical interlude, let's see now what the meaning is that Pierre Lenhardt draws from this liturgical text. Remember that the liturgical texts are rabbinic texts. They're part of ancient rabbinic composition and literature, originally passed down orally, only later in the Middle Ages they begin to be written down in prayer books. Okay. So who's next? Sorry, yes, we can.
Going straight on.
Yes, please.
This blessing celebrates God, who remembers all the covenants with humanity,
since the covenant with Noah, even to the everlasting covenant announced to Ezekiel. In its conclusion, it teaches that the stages which the Lord remembers are the stages in the covenant that is one and only. The stage of the covenant with the first ones whom he brought out of Egypt is the covenant concluded at Sinai, which will never be revoked, and which will be fulfilled in an everlasting covenant. The Sinai covenant was decided by common accord between God and Israel, who committed themselves to do everything that the Lord said.
The blessing that precedes the reading of the Shema in the morning confirms the present-day validity of this biblical message and the permanence of Israel's election sealed by God, who loved Israel with great love and with eternal love. We saw that this blessing committed Israel on the path of unification. Unification of the heart, unification of the fear and the love of God. Unification of humanity through its relationship with God, whose unity Israel proclaims, and whose program of unification Israel adopts out of love. It can be surprising to see that this synchronous blessing does not mention the new covenant announced by Jeremiah. The reason this answer is purely technical. The verse in Jeremiah does not say that the Lord will remember this covenant in order to conclude it. This covenant thus does not have its place in the blessing that is built on remembrances. From the point of view of the contents, the new covenant is a stage in the future, which the only covenant has not yet reached. This comes out clearly in the prophetic text, as well as in rabbinic interpretations of it.
This blessing is pertinent in what it says concerning unity. For the, how do you say that?
Diachronic. Diachronic means across time, across the spectrum of time, down through time. Yeah.
The diachronic diversity of the covenant stages is the guarantee that the covenant is one and true. That no stage is useless. No stage can allow one to forget that God does not destroy what God wants out of love. The new and the old supports one another, and the one is illuminated by the other. Christian exegesis must be that of the good scribes, in the image of the scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven, who draws from his treasure new and old. No recourse to a few verses in the New Testament allows one to replace the old with the new.
Okay, let's just pause there for a moment. So the central point here, as I think you probably can see, is that there is only one covenant. It's a covenant that is renewed through many stages, with Noah, with Abraham, with those who left Egypt at Mount Sinai, and so on and so forth. And they're all stages of the one covenant. Some of you may know that in Christian theology there's a kind of debate in terms of Christianity's relationship with Judaism, whether there's one covenant or two covenants. So is the Christian covenant, which Christians see foretold in Jeremiah, the verse that isn't mentioned in the blessing, yeah, I will write a new covenant on their hearts, yeah, that passage in Jeremiah 31. So some Christians say that means that the Christian covenant is completely new. It's a second covenant. It's not the same as the first covenant. It doesn't mean the first covenant has been revoked. So it's not necessarily supersessionist. It's just respecting the integrity of the first covenant as one thing, and then the new covenant in Jesus as another kind of parallel covenant. And so that's a prominent school of Christian thought. I know some Jewish scholars who deal with such things prefer that approach. Ed Kessler, some of you may know, Ed Kessler clearly says in his book he goes more with that two-covenant approach because he thinks it reflects and respects the integrity of both Judaism and Christianity and doesn't try to kind of conflate them. It's clear, very clear from here that Pierre Lenhardt will have none of it. Yeah? He's all about unity, the unity of the Trinity, but also the unity of the covenants. All the covenants are facets, phases of one everlasting covenant from the very beginning through to the very end. So although he's going to go on now, the next bit, and say, yes, something new did happen with the Christian phase of that covenant, that doesn't mean it's a new and different covenant. It's just a new phase of that one covenant. So he's very much a one covenant guy, for those who are interested in this question. And I have to say, I'm a one covenant guy as well. So, so I'm quite sympathetic to this approach. I find it does make a lot of sense to me. Of course, as a Jew, one has to then finesse what does that mean, but still, I find that approach truer and better somehow than saying we're on two parallel tracks that don't really meet, Okay.
With the Noah covenant with Noah, do Jewish people regard? Sorry. Yes, with the covenant of Noah, do the Jewish people regard that as applying to all people? So, although they put it with the Sinai, that's where it just stops with those people. I see. And then the Abrahamic one with circumcision, that's part of the Sinai covenant. Right, okay, I get it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. And what you're saying is essentially true. That is how it's seen, that there is a universal covenant with Noah, with all creation, and that involves certain obligations, what Jewish tradition calls the 7 Noahide laws, and that applies to everybody. And then there's a covenant specifically with Abraham and his descendants, reaffirmed at Mount Sinai, marked by circumcision, which is somehow more exclusive. And so that would clearly contradict to some extent what Pierre Lenhardt is trying to say here, because it suggests there's a universal covenant on the one hand and then a specific Jewish exclusive particular covenant on the other hand. I don't think he deals explicitly with that issue, but he clearly wouldn't see it that way. And I don't particularly want to see it that way, because I have a big problem with the exclusivist approaches to Judaism. And I think that we're entering difficult waters here, but I think that the covenant with Abraham and the covenant of Sinai is not meant to be exclusive and forever just restricted to that particular group, but actually has a deep universal dimension, which is foretold above all in Deutero-Isaiah. Yes, it's not enough that I have called you just to the house of Jacob and to gather the scattered of Israel. I have called you to be a light to the nations. Of course, for Christians, the light to the nations is Jesus. For Jews, the light to the nations is us. We don't shine it very well, but is us, the Jewish people, whose message is actually universal, not particularistic. So there is a tension there. There's a very definite tension. That's not his main point, because he's not really speaking to Jews here. Yeah, he's speaking to Christians. So, but it's a very good point that you've raised. Yeah. Okay. So I've written somewhere, and I think that what happened with Christianity was an opening out of that covenant, bringing it in a different form, in a different phase, potentially to all humanity. I won't go further with that. I would just say that, so you mentioned Arthur Green, as someone who Pierre Lenhardt has learned from. He's a favourite of mine, and Arthur Green, in his book Radical Judaism, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in that sort of thing, it is truly radical and wonderful and very rooted in Hasidic sources as well as other Jewish sources, because Arthur Green is a great scholar, Hasidism and Jewish mysticism. And Arthur Green also, when he discusses God, Torah and Israel, which we're going to get to shortly in Pierre Lenhardt's version, when he does God, Torah and Israel, he reinterprets each of them in a very radical way. So for him, Israel does not mean the Jewish people. It's part of what it means, but it has a much deeper, broader, universal meaning. And I think that's so inspiring. Yeah? Does that help? Right. Okay, let's read on a bit, shall we? Who do we get to? Yeah.
The blessing used, the neglect, Harisa, which is well known in Pharisaic and Rabbinic tradition, and by Jesus, who used it twice according to the Gospel of Luke. The neglect is made up of the verses down from the three parts of the scripture: Torah, prophets, holy writing. The procedure presupposes the conviction that the Torah is perfect, and the oral Torah can show the unity and the divinity of the whole Torah. The symbol of the neglect evokes the beauty of the beloved woman in the Song of Songs, who is Israel and the oral Torah, whom the beloved God adorns with a necklace made of the tears of the scripture. There is perfect unity in the love of the beloved male. It is obvious that the beloved woman is more important than the necklace, but in looking upon her, the beloved male unites the beauty of the beloved woman and that of her necklace. This let us understand that the oral Torah tradition is, so to say, preferably to the writing Torah scripture.
Right. And this is the bit that Margaret mentioned earlier. It's a really kind of, whoa, that's a remarkable statement that makes you, oh gosh, did he really say that? Otherwise, I guess you're probably quite confused by that paragraph, because it is a very difficult paragraph, and you have to kind of know the whole background of rabbinic interpretations of the Song of Songs as a dialogue between God and Israel, personified as the lover and the beloved, the male and the female, and so he this is quite mystical what he's saying here, but yeah, this is all part of him building up an argument, little thread by thread, of the duality of the presence of a dialogue, a relationship. We'll see in a minute where he's going with this, but he's somehow in there. I'm not sure if I've completely figured it out, but he makes this point that it's mainly a Kabbalistic tradition, a mystical tradition, that says that the male is symbolized by the oral Torah. The male is symbolized by the written Torah, the text, the scripture, and the female, the beloved, is symbolized by the oral Torah, the tradition, the oral tradition. Yeah? And the love of the lover for the beloved is such that he gives preeminence to the partner, to the oral over the written. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Best I can do right now. Okay. Right. Let's go on a bit.
The remembrances blessing teaches with the authority of the oral Torah that there is one single covenant between God and humanity, represented by Israel. The old covenant at Sinai is thus not revoked by the everlasting covenant which Ezekiel announces. From the Christian point of view, this everlasting covenant is already inaugurated in this world's time through Christ's resurrection.
We notice that the blessing does not include Jeremiah in the verses quoted to make its necklace. However, Jeremiah is quoted twice in the verses mentioning the remembrance. All in all, there can be no doubt.
Just to pause there just for a second. Here the numbers are quite important, okay? So it doesn't mention the new covenant in Jeremiah 31:31, but it does have two other quotations from Jeremiah, one of which is from 31:19, which isn't very far from 31:31. So in other words, it's from the same context. So he's saying that new covenant is already kind of, is not mentioned for technical reasons, because that verse, the new covenant verse, doesn't have any mention of remembrance, so it doesn't fit into the remembrance blessing. But it does fit within the general tenor, the general thrust of the blessing, which is to affirm the continuity and universality of the covenant.
Yeah. Would this prayer, would it have been written at the time of Christianity emerging, and would Christians be using that text, the 31:31, so that the Jewish community wouldn't take it on?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be an influence?
That's a really, really good question, and
Please, could you repeat? People wouldn't have.
I'm sorry, I should have given you the mic. So the question was, would this blessing text, this liturgical text for Rosh Hashanah, have been around at the time when Christianity was emerging, and would the rabbis, whoever composed it, have deliberately missed out the new covenant verse in Jeremiah 31:31 because it was being used by Christians, and therefore, and it's certainly true that does not, I don't think that's happening here, no, but it does happen elsewhere. I mean, it's very noticeable, for instance, that there are certain texts that are highlighted in Christianity which are not therefore read much in the synagogue. The suffering servant songs from Isaiah 52-53 never get read because it's a bit uncomfortable. Yeah, I don't think that's the case here. I think he's absolutely right that it's a technical reason that verse doesn't talk about remembrance, and these are all verses, all the verses from the Torah, the prophets, and the writings all mention remembrance in some way. That's the thread that unites the necklace, so to speak, and so that verse just doesn't fit on that particular necklace. But he's saying the idea is nevertheless implicit, that this is a covenant that has been renewed and will be renewed into the future. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I don't think this is... as to when this text dates from, it's very hard to know for sure. It's certainly after the beginning of Christianity, well after. I suspect that a text as complex as this one could not date from before the 3rd century. It may be from the 3rd century. There's great liturgical creativity in the 3rd century, particularly associated with a figure called Rav, the Rabbi, in Babylonia in the early 3rd century, and I think that text may come from that time. To what extent these texts are influenced by the encounter of Judaism and Christianity, the not very friendly encounter, is an interesting question. We might come back to later, but not right here. Okay. Yeah. Just a little bit more here, then we'll skip a bit.
The next paragraph.
Yes, please.
With the resurrection of Jesus, resurrection that is definitive and that has entered into this world, the covenant has already become new and everlasting. The newness is radical, invisible, but it does not abolish the continuity on which it rests, without which it could not be taught. St. Paul says this clearly: if there is no resurrection of the dead, Christ is not risen either. Thus we must hold in faith the paradox of the new, which assumes the old, and old which is never revoked.
Thank you. Okay, I think that last bit speaks for itself. So he is dealing with the newness of the Christian covenant as understood by Christians, to be signalled by the resurrection, and that is in the light of Christian faith. But it's a reflection on the newness implicit always within the covenant. And it's an interesting thought. Yes, Margaret.
Can I just ask, and the word has been used in the bits we've been reading, and the word is fulfilled. And he goes on and says that later in the text, speaking of the covenant in Jesus as fulfillment. For me, that's problematic. I don't know from a Christian point of view whether I'm committing heresy by saying I prefer a phrase like brought to a fullness. I'm not quite sure that sort of helps me. But the notion of fulfillment is so fundamental in Christian understanding and teaching, and I'm just a tad anxious that Pierre uses it.
Interesting. Thank you. That's very interesting. I was just translating it into Hebrew terms. Of course, it's probably the New Testament Greek that is more relevant here than Hebrew, and I don't know what the term for fulfilled would be in Greek. Does anybody here, Greek New Testament scholars, know what the Greek word is? No, I don't know. No, but in translating it into rabbinic terms, which I think is something that Pierre Lenhart would want us to do anyway, the way you say in Hebrew, this is to fulfill what is said, is the Hebrew word is lekayem. Lekayem. Now, as I said, I don't know what the Greek is, but lekayem means to uphold. Yes, lekayem. It comes from the root kum, which means to stand or to rise up, and lekayem is a strong form of the verb meaning to uphold or to support. That's the Hebrew sense of what fulfilling means. Okay, in Hebrew letters or in English?
No, in English.
So L-E-K-A-Y-Y-E-M. Lekayem. Lekayem. And the le bit just means to. That's the prefix, and the kayem is the main word. Kayem, to uphold, to fulfill, but it's in that sense of upholding, and I think that might help.
That's so helpful. Because we get so often in our scriptures, as you know, he did this or this happened in order to fulfill. And we take it literally.
Yeah.
That's so helpful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Because none of them have the Greek to be able to tell us.
Yes, we can easily find the Greek bit, but yeah, definitely it's the kind of phrase you get in rabbinic literature. This lekayem ma shene'emar, to fulfill that which has been said, which is to uphold that which has been said. Yeah, I like that. All right, so I want to move on. I know we're never going to finish it off. What is it? 1:15. We're going to break for lunch at 1. So I think we'll just push on here. If anyone needs a comfort break, maybe in a quarter of an hour we'll have a little tiny mini break. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next section on the next page, which is called the Paradox of Creation. And this is where things really start heating up, as it were. It'll take a page or two to get there, but I think this is the point where his real arguments begin, about the Trinity. So but we start off with a Jewish text. So can we carry on reading? So as to hear the paradox of creation. Yeah.
So as to hear the paradox taught by the Yotze blessing, which is the double paradox of creation and of revelation, we shall quote a shortened form of the text, starting with the Kedusha.
Go on a bit longer.
The Yotze blessing, the first blessing before the reading of the Shema in the morning, turning to a summary of the text. Okay.
Let me just put in an explanation here, because he's already dealt with this at length in the early part of the book. I've skipped all of that. In the morning service, the daily morning service and the daily evening service of the 3 Jewish daily services, there's the reading of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, you shall love the Lord your God, etc. That's the centerpiece, 3 paragraphs of the Shema from Deuteronomy and Numbers. And then around that are blessings. In the morning service, there are 2 blessings before the Shema and 1 blessing after it. And by blessing, I mean a whole paragraph of liturgy which concludes with the phrase, "Blessed are you, O Lord." That's what marks out a blessing. It's all a bit technical. Yeah? So the first blessing before the Shema is the one he's talking about here, the Yotzer, the creator blessing, which talks about God as creator. The second blessing, the one straight before the Shema, is the blessing of love, which is the blessing of the Torah. It's about giving of the Torah in love. He quoted that a bit earlier, "With everlasting love have you loved us," with abounding love. And that focuses on revelation. So we had creation and revelation, then the Shema itself, which is the revelation. And then after the Shema, which finishes with remembering the Exodus from Egypt, comes the third blessing of redemption, which is about God's saving power in history, focusing especially on the crossing of the Red Sea, coming through the waters. Yeah? So they're the 3 key blessings of the morning and evening service: creation, revelation, and redemption, with the Shema there in the middle, the unity of God in the middle. So that's the liturgical structure. He's discussed that in great length, in great detail, and here he's referring back to it to bring his argument onto the next stage. I hope that helps to just give you a sense. Okay? Right.
You want the blessing?
Yes, please.
Be blessed, our rock, our king and our redeemer, creator of saints, who forms servants, all beloved, all chosen, all do the will of their creator, pronoun their producer in fear and trembling. All open their mouth, all together they begin to sing the Kedusha and to say with fear, "Holy, holy, holy, the Lord of hosts, all the earth is filled with his glory." And the wheels of the holy living ones raise themselves with great noise before the seraphim and say, "Blessed is the glory of the Lord from his place." They address their songs to the blessed God.
Okay, I'm just going to give 2 little comments on that before we go on. So he's just given a few selections from a much longer liturgical composition. And as you can see, it includes the Holy, 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 yeah? The Sanctus. The Sanctus verse from Isaiah comes 3 times in the morning service in Jewish liturgy. 3 quite different times. This is the first of the times. It's called the Sitting-Down Kedusha, because you sit down for it. Later on, in the central prayer comes the Standing Up Kedusha, where we actually join with the angels, as it were, in their song of praise. Here we just talk about the angels doing their song of praise. Then later on we join with it. And then there's a third one, towards the end of the morning service, which includes the Aramaic translation. Liberal Jews don't do it, but it's there in the traditional liturgy every day. And it's called the Studying Kedusha. So you first read about the angels doing it, then you actually do it, and then you study the meaning of it, as it were, the 3 phases. So I just wanted to mention that. And secondly, to put this in context, today is, as I said earlier, the 2nd day of Shavuot in Orthodox tradition, and the Haftarah, the prophetic reading appointed for the 2nd day of Shavuot, is Ezekiel chapter 1, concluding with a brief visit to Ezekiel chapter 3, which, as you can see, is the verse quoted here. So this is also of the day. In my synagogue in Leicester, I decided to read that yesterday as our Haftarah, as our prophetic reading, that great vision of Ezekiel with the wheels and the chariot and the living creatures and all the stuff that you can't understand, but it's wonderful. And the angels, concluding with the angels singing, Baruch kavod Adonai mimkomo, blessed be the glory of the Lord from his place. He's going to say a lot about that. It's a very mysterious verse, but a very important one. Right, let's go on.
The kosher blessing speaks of the Creator God and of God's creation. The heavenly liturgy that was revealed to Israel through Isaiah and Ezekiel entered into the blessing because of the experience of a group that was interested in contemplation and meditation on the mystery of creation. The mystery of the synagogue adopted this version of the Kedusha because it is simpler. This version makes it possible to present the paradox of revelation within the blessing, the main aim of which is to teach creation.
Okay, that's very complicated. Let's not worry about that bit too much. It's the next bit that gets really interesting. Okay.
The blessing received from Isaiah, the vision of the glory of the Holy God in his temple. This glory appears in the world. As Israel's later tradition will say, the glory is the reality of God's presence in the world. It is the Shekinah, the particular real presence of God in the temple and in the world. Isaiah's seraphim acclaim this presence, which is seated on an elevated throne, and Isaiah, who has this vision, is sent to communicate it to Israel. From this point on, the heavenly liturgy has come down to earth, but by its origin it remains in contact with the Holy God, whose place remains unknown. The living ones of Ezekiel communicate their experience to the prophet. The glory of the Shekinah manifests itself in the world and in the known place in the temple, but it proceeds from its place, which remains unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Paradox of the known place that reveals the unknown place is so fundamental that it will be used to justify one of the names given to God by tradition. God is called the place, because God is the place par excellence, the place of the world, which does away with the cosmic illusion according to which the world is the real place, the place that counts.
The paradox of revelation is expressed here in the simplest possible way. God wants to make himself known as holy, as separate, as other, as unknown in the temple, the known place that points to God's unknown place.
We shall return to this teaching when we look at the paradox of revelation. However, here we must first enter into the primordial paradox, which is that of creation.
The Kedusha in our blessing does not lead us to understand that God and God's Shekinah are one single and same reality. Israel is not yet at the point of saying this, but Israel will say it in the great Kedusha that we shall study later.
One more.
The insertion of the Kedusha in the blessing that speaks of creation makes it possible to assume in depth the paradox of creation and openness to the question that constantly comes up. How can God, who creates the world through kindness and who remains present in it in order to sustain its existence, remain in silence and absence in God's transcendent holiness, abandoning the world to misfortune, to evil, to the suffering of those who are innocent?
That's it. We'll stop there. We'll pause there for a minute. Okay. Let's try and get a little grasp of what is said in this passage. It is beginning to build up towards a certain climax in his argument through this study of the Kedusha, of the idea that God has revealed to the prophets, to Isaiah and Ezekiel, what the angels are doing in heaven, the angels' proclamation of God's holiness. And so in revealing it to the prophets, it becomes available to us to begin to participate in that, to sing that angelic song of praise. And by doing that, we, as it were, unite heaven and earth in joining with the angels in doing that. I'm speaking here entirely symbolically, literally, I don't know what happens, but symbolically that's what happens, yeah? And so that establishes what he's talking about here, this paradox. He loves the word paradox. Yeah, the idea that the angels sing in Ezekiel, "Blessed be the glory of the Lord from his place," meaning they don't know what that place is. Yeah, it's hidden. It's beyond even the angels, let alone us. Yeah, but paradoxically, God has made that known to us. From out of that hidden depth, this has been revealed, has become available to us so that we can participate in it, while at the same time the revelation is that it is hidden. The revelation is a revelation of hiddenness. And that's the paradox. The revelation means making known, and hiddenness is what is not known. So this is something that is both known and unknown at the same time. It sounds like that American Secretary of State. Known unknowns and unknown knowns. I don't know. Anyway, yeah. So it's both known and unknown, and that is the paradox. That we know that which is unknown while still knowing that it is unknown. Yeah. And so he's beginning, and into that mix, he introduces, two key rabbinic terms for God. So I don't know why I keep looking this way, and I neglect this side of the room because of the windows. The two rabbinic terms for God, one is hamakom, the place, a very ancient rabbinic, one of the earliest rabbinic names for God. That occurs in early rabbinic texts. God is called Hamakom, the place, probably because it was a reference to the temple. Yeah, when you want to talk about the queen, you say the palace. The palace has said. You know, palaces don't speak, but it's symbolic. It's a metonym, or whatever the word is. Yeah. So similarly, the rabbis from an early stage, going probably back into the 1st century, called God Hamakom. The one who is there in that place is the place being the temple, but the place also being the unknown place, the place that we cannot know because we can't know where God is. And the other key term, which is going to be central to his whole argument, is Shekhinah, the divine presence. And he's going to talk a great deal about that. We'll get to it a bit more in a minute. So Shekhinah comes from, as he'll explain to us, comes from shachan, to dwell. It comes from the statement in Exodus, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." V'shachanti b'tocham. And the rabbis made out of that verb to dwell this sort of abstract noun, Shekhinah, the dwelling, the indwelling. So that may also have had to do with the temple in its beginnings, but it becomes a much bigger idea of the presence of God in the world. So we're beginning to get a feel for where he's going here, that the presence of God in the world hints at the presence of God beyond the world. The God that is revealed to us shows us that there is a God who is hidden from us, but it's all the same God. Yeah, and we're not at the end of that argument yet. We're just beginning to lay the groundwork. But he wants us to get to dwell with this paradox. I think he wants us to dwell with it for a bit. That which is both hidden and revealed. And you can hear, just as one says it, hidden and revealed. God beyond and God within. And how many are there? There are two. Yeah? God beyond and God within are two, but are they two different things? Well, clearly not, okay? Clearly not. Because it is God's own revelation through the prophets that is showing us the God who is in a place that even the angels do not know, as it were. Yeah? So the two are completely united. He says we're not really at that point yet, but you know, the two are one. It's all God, but there is this twofold way of our understanding God, yes, as hidden and as revealed. I think I made the point. Okay, good. Right. It's 12:30 now. We will go to 1 o'clock. Do people feel the need for just 5 minutes of stretching legs? Someone was shaking their head, but Margaret said, I think I might need 2 minutes. Too much tea. Let's just get a little bit more in before lunch. Yes, I think that's all right. That's understandable. Now, I'm just wondering how we can get this in. So at the end of that previous section, he invoked the problem of evil. How, if a good God has created the world and dwells within the world, how can there be misfortune and evil and suffering for the innocent? And he then, on page 51, he dwells with that question a little bit, the goodness of God, the paradox of goodness coexisting with the evil and suffering in the world. And he brings in a rabbinic text about famous rabbinic text. This is in the middle of page 51. The human being must bless for misfortune just as he blesses for happiness. Yeah? One must bless God for the misfortune just like for the happiness. And then he invokes, further down the page, the interesting figure of Nahum Ish Gamzo, who is famous for having welcomed all misfortunes with the expression Gamzo Latova, this too is for good. So all the terrible things that happened to him, he said, Gamzo Latova. This he communicated to his student Rabbi Akiva. Yeah? Rabbi Akiva, according to tradition, Nahum Ish Gamzu taught Rabbi Akiva, the greatest central figure in the whole rabbinic movement, that every single detail of scripture is relevant. One can learn laws and new insights from an extra letter in a word or an extra word in a sentence. And his putting this together with the teaching of Nahum Ish Gamzo, that everything that happens is a sign of God's goodness, even though we experience it as misfortune. This is a mystery we're not going to solve right now, of course. But what he's trying to get across is this is part and parcel of the rabbinic idea of revelation, of how creation works and how God reveals to us through the prophets, but also through the rabbis, that this is how it works, that God is present in everything. And then he talks about the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva as somehow the summit of this teaching of justifying God's judgment. I'm kind of summarizing a lot of stuff here to lead up to where he's heading. So,
Mark, would you equate that to the writing in Corinthians about all things? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry.
Would you equate that to the writing in Corinthians where it says all things work together for good according to those his purposes?
Probably. I imagine so. I haven't thought about that, but I imagine so. Okay, yes. Thank you. So I'd like to pick this up then on page 52, where he's talked about rabbinic experiences of martyrdom, Rabbi Akiva dying for his faith and blessing God and affirming God's unity as he breathes his last tortured by the Romans. He then mentions Rabbi Hanania ben Teradion, another one of the rabbinic martyrs. He was the one who was burnt by the Romans for the crime of teaching Torah, and they wrapped the Torah scroll around him. And as he was, and his students standing around asked, "What do you see?" He said, "I see the parchment burning, but the letters flying upwards." Yes, a beautiful story in the Talmud. So having invoked those images of martyrdom within rabbinic literature, let's take this further. So from the paragraph that says, we again find the non-division, the third paragraph on page 52. Who is next to read?
We again find the non-division, the negative way that leads to the positive proclamation of unity. The masters who die out of love, Nahum Ish Gamzo, Rabbi Akiva, and before them, Jesus, witness to the one God. When in the Gospel, according to Matthew, Jesus teaches that one alone is the good one. His words are to be heard in the rich context we have explained based on Psalm 119. You, the good, the one who does good, teach me your will. In his commentary on Matthew 19, Paul Bilgerbeck returns to this context. He mentions in particular Mishnah Avot 6:3, and there is no good if it is not the Torah, for it is said, listen, sons, to the lesson of a father, for it is a good teaching that I have given you. Do not abandon my Torah. The use of the double negative, there is no, if it is not, is the way to affirm even more strongly what one wants to affirm. The formula used by Jesus, one alone is the good, cannot contradict the fact that the Torah is alone the eminently good. God and the Torah are the good par excellence. The one God is the good. In order to do good, one must observe the commandments of God's Torah.
Okay.
Summing up, we can say God and the Torah are one, single reality. And Israel is the witness to this. God and the Torah are one single reality, which, in its kindness, creates the world and sustains its existence. We saw this affirmation of ongoing creation, which the Yotzeh blessing renews each morning. The verse from Isaiah that is used to support this teaching, and which stands in the present tense, is modified in order to avoid anyone saying in prayer that God created evil. But its difficult wording remains. One such difficulty is linked with the one that never ceases to torment Israel and believing humankind. How can the Creator God, the all-powerful, the good, tolerate the existence of misfortune, of suffering, and of the omnipresence of evil?
Thank you. We're going to leave that question hanging there just at the moment, but I want to just go back and see where he's got to at this point in this complex argument. Yeah, he has to read carefully and attentively, and he's got to the point of saying God and the Torah are one single reality, and Israel is the witness to this. Okay, in what sense are God and the Torah one single reality? It's because the Torah is the revelation of God, and that is part of that paradox of the God who reveals that God is unrevealed. Yeah? So the Torah is the God revealing, as it were, which is one with the unknown God that it reveals. Okay? So God and the Torah, the hidden and the revealed, the revealer and the revelation, are one single reality. And then he adds, and this is going to become a major point later on, Israel is the witness to this. And so here we have three. Yeah? God, Torah, and Israel, which are, as he'll go on to talk about at length, presented often in Jewish theology, particularly in mystical Jewish theology, as a kind of indivisible triad. God, Torah, and Israel are all one, says the Zohar, Kabbalistic work of the 13th century. When it says Israel there, it doesn't necessarily mean Israel as in individual actual Jews. It certainly doesn't mean the country of Israel, it's about the people of Israel, but it's talking about Israel as a sort of, as a spiritual reality, as a kind of divine entity, rather than...
God-loving witness.
Okay, yeah, so Israel bears witness to this, okay? So he's going to build up, just to sort of to give the end away, he's going to build up to an argument, yeah, that that God, Torah, and Israel corresponds in some way to the Christian Trinity. Yeah. How that happens, there's a lot more to come, and it's not immediately obvious, of course. But Israel, as the witness to this, is an expression for him of the Holy Spirit, which is the bearing witness, is the spirit of prophecy, is the spirit that makes this known in the world, makes the unity of God and Torah known in the world. We'll follow this up later, don't worry. How are we doing? Okay. I just want to bring something in here. He's talked here about the Torah, and he has a bit more to say about that. The Torah as the second part of that threefold revelation of God, Torah, and Israel. What I found, one of the things that I felt to be lacking somehow from the book is a discussion about the Torah as specifically the Word of God, and the comparison of this with Christ as the Logos, as the Word revealed in the prologue to the fourth Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the way in which in Rabbinic theology, especially Rabbi Akiva and his circle and his followers, the Torah becomes the Logos, becomes the eternal Word of God, which is the expression, the complete, full expression of God's being in the process of creation. So, although the Torah, in its basic sense, was the Torah given at Mount Sinai, it's the revelation, the rabbis, beginning with Rabbi Akiva, say the Torah was already involved in creation. The world was created through the Torah, just as, of course, in the Gospel of John, it's through him all things were made. Yeah? Through the Word all things were made, which of course is in the Creed.
For me, the Torah was, it was two sentences ago.
The Torah was involved already in creation. The Torah, for the rabbis, pre-existed in some spiritual way, pre-existed the creation of the world, and it was with and through the Torah that God created the world. The rabbis identify the Torah with the biblical figure of wisdom. Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 3 and Proverbs chapter 8 especially. Wisdom, which is God's companion, God's vehicle for creation. Yeah?
And so the world, creation happened to hold Torah.
Creation happened to hold Torah, you said. Well, that's true. There is a sense, there is a very strong sense in Rabbinic and certainly in later Jewish thinking that the existence of the world somehow depended right from the beginning on Israel's acceptance of the Torah. Yes, there's these rabbinic interpretations. If Israel hadn't accepted the Torah, then the whole world would have been returned to primordial chaos. Yes.
That's the Protestant view.
And that would be the Protestant.
Really? Interesting.
Catholics can get that one.
Thank you.
Would you be comfortable with Jesus as word being the equivalent of Torah as word?
Of course, that's what I've written about. I've written about Christ through Jewish eyes. That this is where the to me the real interesting parallel lies of the Torah as the Logos, as the Word of God, involved in creation, revelation, and redemption, paralleled by Jesus for Christians as the eternal Word involved with creation, revelation, and redemption. And that's what I find a little bit missing in this book. And I'm not saying that the book is inadequate because of that, because Pierre Lenhardt pursues his own line of thought, which is much more about the Shekhinah, as we've just introduced, and he's going to say a great deal more about the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence of God in the world. But he kind of turns away a little bit, I think, from talking about the Torah and its position in rabbinic theology. And I find that a little bit odd, and I'd love to sit with him and talk about it and see. So I'm sure he's thought about it, but it doesn't come through in the book. Yeah.
Does he use John in the book?
Very little. I mean, he does quote John here and there, but he doesn't dwell on Logos theology. Now, I just wonder if the reason why he doesn't dwell on Logos theology is could be because of two things. Maybe because he wants to stay with Jewish terminology, with rabbinic categories of thought, and he finds Shekhinah, the indwelling presence of God in the world, the most powerful rabbinic idea. That might be part of it. But I also just wonder, because he is so concerned with showing, and there's much more of this to come, the unity of God's transcendent being and God's immanent presence in the world, of God and Shekhinah as truly one, maybe for him the Logos idea, and indeed the Torah idea, felt a little bit too much like what's called subordinationism in Christian theology, that it's making a kind of hierarchy where there's God, and then there's something in between God and the world, but which is God only in a derivative sense. And that would be moving away from the Trinitarian orthodoxy which he proclaimed in the introduction, where the three persons of the Trinity have to be absolutely equal and co-eternal and completely of one substance. And maybe for him, I'm just speculating because he doesn't say this, but maybe that's why he avoided going to the Logos idea, into the Torah as Logos and Christ as Logos, because it can become a sort of a hierarchy. Maybe that's the problem he had with it. But that was my biggest theological quibble. I have two theological quibbles. That's one of them. We'll get to the other one later. All right. Okay.
There's a book in it for you, Mark.
Which I think. We've got 5 minutes before till 1. I think, at least my watch.
This is wrong.
That's wrong, is it? Okay. I thought my watch was wrong. So I'm just going to kind of push us through to the end of this section now. So at the bottom of page 54, he says the key words in this passage, the passage which is a passage from Hasidic literature that we haven't got time to read, sadly. It's very beautiful. One of the great Hasidic mystics of the 18th century. The key words in this passage are glory, kavod, the root of creation, shorish habriya, and vitality, the vital strength, chayut or chiyut. And then he says, glory is the Shekhinah, the presence of the Creator God in the world. The root of creation is the Creator God who creates through the Shekhinah. The vitality, over on page 55, the vitality, chiyut, is the vital strength that comes from God through the Torah, or again from God himself, who is your life. So you can see that where he's pointing there, God, the root of creation, which is so God, the root of creation, God's glory expressed in creation, and the vitality, the chiyut, which comes from God and flows through creation. And you can hear there the pre-echoes of Father, Son, and Spirit, which he's heading to.
What word for vitality? Is it sustaining?
Chiyut, no, it's from chayim, like life, chay, life. Chiyut is an abstract noun meaning life force or vitality. Okay. Then comes a really interesting section, beginning on page 56. Again, I'm going to be ruthless and not read it. He introduces Leibniz and Heidegger and all sorts of difficult stuff. He introduces a key mystical text, the Sefer Yetzirah. Let's look briefly at the middle of page 57. Middle of page 57. I'm just picking out the points where there's bold print, basically, now. God, the Torah, Israel, thus constitute a fundamental triad since the creation of the world. Israel, to whom is given responsibility for revelation, makes this triad known to the nations. So it's through Israel, through the Jewish people, one could say, that the Torah and God became known in the world. This particular election of Israel is paradoxically the narrow path of an election that is open to all. That comes back to that point before, Jill, of the exclusiveness or inclusiveness. It's the narrow path that is paradoxically open to all.